St Patrick's Day is now a holiday in Ireland by Act of Parliament. All banks and business houses are closed on that day, and the streets of all the cities wear a Sunday aspect. The railways run excursions throughout the country, and the day is wholly given over to rejoicing and political meetings. While the drink shops may remain open, public opinion obtains their closing. Even in Dublin, more than half of them were closed last year. That's the picture of St Patrick's Day painted by the Chicago Citizen in the early 20th century. And in the early years of that century, a curious battle was fought each St Patrick's Day between the Gaelic League and the publicans of the city. And for the League, the day of the patron saint was one that offered great opportunities, and the publicans, it was a day, of course, that offered great profit. The belief, the Gaelic League's paper told its readership in 1909, generous but false, that to be truly Gaelic involves drunkenness, has been well nigh rooted out of the land. And the man who now tries to make his nationality an excuse for inebriety is looked upon either as a fool or a knave. Certainly, Patrick's Day was a day on which there was much merriment in the city, and in the newspapers, the court pages were always busy in the days after the 17th of March. A Corporal Bauer of the Army Service Corps found himself court-martialled, readers of the press were told, for having on St Patrick's Day been drunk when in charge of a government motor car in 1906. And for the ordinary citizenry, judges routinely scorned those who found themselves before them in the days after Patrick's Day. But the bill that made Patrick's Day a national holiday, it passed through Westminster in 1903, and that meant that the way in which the day itself was celebrated in Ireland was transformed forever, because prior to that, it was generally the Sunday following the 17th that had been the day on which to honour Patrick, but now the movable feast had arrived, and unsurprisingly for cultural nationalists, that day offered a potential pitfall into stereotypes which they were keen to destroy. In 1960, a member of the Seanad, the upper house of Dáil Éireann, would recall how I'm old enough to remember that the closing on St Patrick's Day of public houses was a Gaelic League notion. More than 60 years ago, the Gaelic League idea was that drinking was so rife and degrading at that time that public houses should be closed on Patrick's Day as a national gesture. It's also interesting to remember that they also inaugurated the notion of an industrial parade on the day. I remember giving out handbills outside public houses to see that they were closed. I also remember that in Dublin, a number of people closed their front doors on St Patrick's Day and opened the back door so that they had it both ways. Our drinking habits were then much worse. On consideration generally, it is reasonable now, he said, that public houses should be open on the same conditions on St Patrick's Day as on a Sunday. The fact that those words were said in 1960, almost 4 decades on from the birth of the new state, is really telling of the long-term impacts of the Gaelic League's campaign. And this episode is a journey back, I suppose, to the battle for St Patrick's Day itself and an exploration of how the day went in Dublin. I hope you enjoyed the parade if you're going to see it, or you get out of Dodge if that's your preferred idea of a good Paddy's Day. Thank you as ever for tuning into the podcast in a strange period of life now, moving my life from one house to another. But I hope this one gives you something to enjoy over the next few days. And let's allow the great John McCormack to sing us in.
And now I'll sing you a hymn to St. Patrick, which I learned at school in far off Athlone as a boy. All right. Hail, glorious St. Patrick, dear Saint of our isle, on us thy poor children bestow a sweet smile, and now thou art high in thy mansions above, on Erin's green valleys look down in thy love.
St Patrick's Day recalls those songs, yes, but it also recalls the diaspora. The New York parade, a thing that I regard as being perhaps not entirely Irish or entirely American, but fundamentally Irish-American, a distinct thing. That parade has its own long-standing traditions and cultures.
Officials of church and state review the marchers from the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue. But the real dignitaries of the day are the Kellys and the Ryans, the O'Connells and the O'Briens.
An observer of that parade in 1919 was struck by its passion and politics. It was St. Patrick's Day, and the city of New York was held for a parade of Irish Americans who marched down Fifth Avenue with bands and banners. It was miles long, and all about were hundreds of thousands of people in the crowds wearing shamrock and green flags. One banner, held by priests, bore the words, "We stand for a free and independent Ireland." And another, carried by women and girls, said, "England, damn your concessions, we want our country." In the crowds, I overheard many conversations which convinced me utterly that there will be no absolute friendship between England and America until Ireland's desires have been granted. And I prayed to God that this may happen to safeguard the peace of the world, which depends upon American goodwill. 1919. But our story today is very much on the domestic front, and while a parade of the kind we know from New York would not emerge here until the 1930s, there were other battles around the day, one concerning drink. Public drunkenness was actually on the wane in a big way by the early 20th century, but the truth and the perception are sometimes very different things. And in one American newspaper, a picture was painted of Dublin that was pretty sensationalist for 1908 and sounded much more like the gin palaces of an earlier century. I don't suppose there's any city in the world where there was so much drunkenness amongst women as there is in Dublin, he wrote. Dublin is the only city I have been to where women go staggering about the streets. And what is even more lamentable, he told his readers, is that the public is so hardened to the repulsive spectacle that it does not attract as much curiosity as the appearance of an ordinary drunken man upon the streets of Chicago or New York. Women stagger from the doors of saloons along the sidewalks with dishevelled hair and disordered garments without attracting any attention whatsoever. In seeking to close the pubs on St. Patrick's Day, I suppose the Gaelic League was going to war with that kind of international perception of Ireland. And they also found themselves in unusual alliances, as we'll hear today, from the suffragette movement to the temperance movement. There were all kinds of people who backed the same horse in this race and facing off against unusual opponents, including some nationalists in the ranks of the Irish Parliamentary Party, the Home Rule Party. And for the Home Rulers, who had plenty of publicans in their ranks, in fact, one of their most famous MPs, wee Joe Devlin from Belfast, had formerly been the assistant manager of Belfast's very famous pub, Kelly Cellars. And I think the Home Rulers had a sense that on an island of very little industry, alcohol was one of them. Brewers, distillers, and indeed publicans were all people you wanted to keep on your side. But I think to understand the battle the Gaelic League fought against pubs opening on Patrick's Day, we need to have a sense of all the protagonists in the story. There's the Home Rulers, there's the publicans, in this case represented by the LGVPA, the Licensed Grocers and Vintners Protection Association, and there's the Gaelic League itself. The Gaelic League, I think, is sometimes presented wrongly as being born primarily from a kind of academic curiosity in the Irish language. People like Douglas Hyde, Douglas Tehida. But I think the primary thing that motivated the Gaelic League was not an academic interest in the language, but a real sense of panic around the vital work of saving a language from complete extinction. The very shocking findings of the 1891 census, which revealed that less than 4% of Irish people were being raised speaking the Irish language, that stood in really stark contrast with the findings of even a decade earlier. And the Irish language really did seem to be on life support by the 1890s. The League set its sight on winning what you might say were small, but in some ways were massively symbolic victories. For example, the use of the Irish language within the postal system. For example, lobbying for the place of Irish within the educational system. Trying to bring the Irish language more and more into everyday life through things like shop fronts and advertising. Trying to convince daily national newspapers to give over space to Irish language content, and trying to convince churches of all denominations to use the Irish language in mass and service. And it's worth emphasising the extent to which the Gaelic League understood the importance of not becoming an insular, academic, middle-class pursuit. A language preserved in books alone becomes a dead language. Hence the necessity of awakening the hundreds of thousands who speak Irish, rooting out the false shame based on ignorance, which alone has caused the decay of our language and fostering the love of the national tongue. The class composition of the Gaelic League across the country could be surprisingly diverse. I mean, when a branch was born in Derry City, for example, a policeman, an intelligence policeman whose job it was to watch all of these things happening, he noted that many of the members are, quote, of the shop assistant and factory worker class. They are young men and girls of good character. And in Dublin, branches of the Gaelic League emerged, in some of the most affluent areas of the city. But there are also branches in places like Ringsend and Irish Town, where dockers and manual labourers were in the majority, and there were even branches connected to the working men's club, including the Workmen's Club and the Keys. John Casey, later Sean O'Casey, got his interest in the Gaelic League ideal from a tram conductor. Working class people were kind of introducing each other to the concept of joining the Gaelic League and the idea of learning the language. And initially, Sean O'Casey joined a branch that met on Talbot Street, a street that then, just like now, was considered pretty far from salubrious, right beside the Monto and by a train station. By the end of 1899, the Gaelic League was organising evening classes for 40,000 people. I think the key to the success was the book that they used, Simple Lessons in Irish, which was on the cusp of its 20th edition in absolutely no time. And as Christopher Murray, biographer of Sean O'Casey, tells it, O'Casey just flung himself into the Gaelic League. And in his own words, he worked harder at night than I did in the daytime, teaching Irish, sweeping floors and lighting fires before classes began, and all for love. And really, it was love and a spirit of volunteerism that really drove the Gaelic League forward in Dublin. Sean O'Casey, was born into a Protestant house, and in that, he was far from unique in the Gaelic League. There was even the Committee of Protestant Gaelic Leaguers who sought service in Irish from churches at least once a month, who wanted the use of parochial halls for Gaelic League activity and the introduction of the Irish language into Protestant schools. The work of the Gaelic League here, a young O'Casey wrote, is to make Dublin Irish. Is it making Dublin Irish? If present conditions continue, will it ever do so? Probably never. But O'Casey, of course, would leave cultural nationalism behind him and fully embrace the red flag moment that came with Jim Larkin's arrival in Ireland. I think later in life, in his autobiographies, O'Casey sometimes had a tendency of talking down the Gaelic League as a middle-class endeavour, far removed from the lives of ordinary Irish people. But actually, I think that was pretty unfair. So it's easy to see why St. Patrick's Day was a popular cause for the Gaelic League. I mean, who can be against a bank holiday, for one thing? Not least one honouring a figure that's broadly adored. The great Protestant cathedral of Dublin is St. Patrick's Cathedral. Patrick holds meaning right across the political aisles and the social aisles and the cultural aisles. And I think if the Gaelic League was looking abroad for inspiration, the Irish-American St. Patrick's Day tradition might have demonstrated to them how the day could be reimagined, because in the 19th century, Patrick's Day in America had often been a quite chaotic affair. The so-called tradition because it's a nonsense, of drowning the Shamrock had brought some shame on Irish community leaders. And in time, the Patrick's Day parade in major Irish enclaves and cities in America would take on dramatically new forms. I mean, the parades would often come to evoke symbols of both Ireland and America, and were perhaps increasingly designed to present the Irish as part of American society itself. I mean, they were proud of their distinct origin, but this was an American thing. And while sectarian and political tensions had led to some ugly scenes, most famously New York's 1867 parade, the day had become a lot more settled in the early 20th century in America. Parades were earlier in the day, often following Mass and service, and there was tremendous visual pageantry to it all. So for the Gaelic League, the first hurdle, I suppose, on their Patrick's Day mission was to get the bank holiday itself. And in the House of Commons, James O'Mara, who had been the youngest member of Parliament on taking his seat in 1900 at just 27 years of age, he was truly instrumental in winning the day, but there was no real opposition to the proposal. But with the day won from 1903, there were then competing visions of how it should be spent. And it was clear, reading on Claidheamh Soluis, the newspaper of the Gaelic League, that they wanted a Patrick's Day that was both sombre and sober. Reports from town to town are almost comical now in some cases, slating publicans who kept their doors open, even naming them on occasion. In Ennis, readers of the paper were told, the publicans refused to close on Law Éile Póraigh. They held higher enclave on the subject and, like their Dublin brethren, elected to pose as public benefactors instead. One publican insisted it would take a proclamation from Dublin Castle for him to close his doors on the day. Some of the publicans who shut their front doors, readers of the paper were told, and put up their shutters, kept their back doors open. They felt, however, that they were doing a guilty and forbidden thing, and one might from time to time catch them glancing down the street to see whether a Gaelic Leaguer was prowling about. But by the following year, in 1904, the Gaelic League was really increasing its pressure on publicans to close, with a rally in the Mansion House seeking widespread pub closures on the day. And it was increasingly clear that while some publicans were willing to concede the day, others would fight to the bitter end. To give an idea of the pressure publicans were being put under, one member of the Gaelic League would later tell the Bureau of Military History how there were cards printed bearing the words, "Don't drink, don't work, don't shop on the national holiday." These were to be clipped onto sticks and carried in processions. There was a great demand for these cards, a crowd being continually waiting in front of our offices to have the cards given to them. Then forms were got out in which traders were asked to sign, one being a provisional and the other an absolute promise to close on St. Patrick's Day. It took a lot of arguing and a lot of hard work to get the businessmen to sign something. Bradley Cadell, in a brilliant book exploring drink and culture in 19th century Ireland, but that includes the Patrick's Day battles of the early 20th century, he makes the point that social class seems to have been a massive factor in all of this. The pubs that tended to stay open on Patrick's Day, he says, were largely located in working class neighbourhoods of the city, presumably where the demand for remaining open was highest and competition for working class custom was more intense. In 1906, Bradley writes, the Freeman's Journal reported that many pubs on the main thoroughfares and in middle class districts were closed, but others in some poor areas, witnesses claimed, remained ready for business with, and I love this description, doors thrown wide open and crowded with ill-dressed men and, sadder still to say, poorly clad women. Fighting in the publican's corner, though deeply divided, was the Licensed Grocers and Vintners Protection Association, forerunner of today's LVA. And they found themselves in a really peculiar and somewhat perilous position because, publicans were keen to be seen as responsible and indeed patriotic, but they also wanted to defend the interests of their members commercially, the right of the publican to open his or her doors and make money. And also they found themselves doing something quite unusual for a body of their kind, which was batting for the consumer and the right of the public consumer to go to the pub if they wanted to. And a war of words played out between their trade journal, the Irish Vintner and Grocer, and the nationalist press. The Irish Vintner and Grocer, that cultured organ of opinion, had better be more careful in future, one nationalist newspaper warned, because the swagger, language and manners of the public house may be dangerous when reproduced in public print. For many publicans, I think, if the charge was that public drunkenness was ultimately the fault of publicans and lay at the door of the public house, well, these were businesses that took pride in themselves and the service and standards that they upheld. And as Cadell notes, according to this perspective, in order for the drink trade to continue its successful defence against allegations that the pub was the facilitator of drunkenness and chaos, no concessions could be made over St. Patrick's Day. In 1906, the association passed a resolution encouraging their members to remain open on the day. And it seems many of them did, because on Claidheamh Soluis, the Gaelic League paper, the positive note that they were sounding in 1903, 1904, 1905, it is nowhere to be found in 1906. It is melancholy, they wrote, to have to record that in one respect, the completeness, harmony and dignity of the celebration of the national holiday were sadly marred. In Dublin, the great bulk of the publicans kept their houses open. The results were seen in the police courts on Monday morning, where there were 82 cases of drunkenness, as against 12 in the corresponding period last year. They accused those men of being responsible for a national dishonour. As a direct outcome of their actions, sin and sorrow were brought into 82 Dublin homes on Law Éile Póraigh, and the fair fame of Ireland's capital was dragged through the dust. So the growing feeling was that while an Act of Parliament had brought the national holiday about, another Act of Parliament might be required to close the pubs. And in this, there was a major problem, because while James O'Meara would once again be the one to bring the bill forwards, there was clearly significant opposition to this one, even within his own party, trying to kick the can down the road. Some Home Rule MPs gave notice before Parliament that the bill be read a second time this day 6 months. In other words, thrown out for now. And on Claidheamh Soluis, the paper was furious, noting that one of those MPs, Harrington, was once a president of a Gaelic League branch. We should be glad to know, they asked readers, whether the Irish party is willing or able to control the actions of its members in such a matter as this. Now, I think the Home Rule MPs were in a really tough position here. Some of them were themselves connected to the pub trade, and just like now, pubs were part of the political machine of organisation where people met and organised. British publicans also had lots of friends in Parliament, but there was no clear united front. There was no publican lobby. The more respectable houses were closing voluntarily. So in the absence of a united front, there was no real fight against the Act. And O'Meara's Act succeeded in closing the pubs on St. Patrick's Day. Now, be that as it may, there was still considerable drinking done across Ireland on the day, with some pubs risking the wrath of the law. Beyond the Gaelic Leaguers, there were many other people who saw political opportunity around St. Patrick's Day. It was a day that conjured up not only religious images in the Irish mind, but political ones. The Fenian movement had been born on St. Patrick's Day, 1867. Bulmer Hobson would later remember that the reorganisation of the Irish Republican Brotherhood took place on St. Patrick's Day, 1873, at a meeting held in the Brazen Head Hotel, Bridge Street in Dublin, an old Dublin posting house that I believe was used as a meeting place for the United Irishmen in the late 18th century. So there was a strong link between the date, the 17th of March, and the Fenian tradition. But more surprisingly, the day also offered something to the suffragettes. In the Irish Citizen, newspaper of the Irish Women's Franchise League, some of the same moral concerns as the Gaelic League were clear. The Irish Women's Franchise League often took aim at publicans, at the practice of men being paid their wages in public houses, at alcohol as a destroyer of households. And a 1915 St. Patrick's Day edition showed the modern St. Patrick wearing a Votes for Women sash on the front of the newspaper, surrounded by snakes bearing names like sham patriotism, gambling, municipal corruption, low dance halls, white slavery, prostitution, and liquor traffic. In the paper, the Irish Women's Franchise League often went after a certain kind of pub, the spirit grocer. Think about Keogh's in South Anne Street or Walsh's in Stony Batter. Pubs that doubled up as shops. Women's societies, they told their readers, should agitate for the abolition of the spirit grocer's licence. A large part of the drinking amongst women is due to this licence. How many women and even men would shrink from being seen going into an open bar, but find an excuse to buy something else in order to shake their alcoholic thirst? Certainly, the Gaelic League did completely transform the feeling of St. Patrick's Day across the island of Ireland. On St. Patrick's Day 1916, there would have been many Gaelic Leaguers in the ranks of the Irish Volunteers who paraded across Dublin and the island more broadly that day. In retrospect, probably a pretty significant thing, with the rising just over a month away. I wonder if the policemen who watched the Volunteers parade that St. Patrick's Day had any sense what was coming. One journalist praised that day as, not many years ago, it was far from edifying to think that the celebration of the feast day of the national apostle should take the form of intoxicated dissipation, which called for condemnation from pulpit and platform. There were only a dozen cases of drunkenness before the courts after St. Patrick's Day 1916. People had other things on their mind. But Patrick's Day, of course, ultimately belongs to all traditions. John Redmond, leader of the Home Rulers, spent Patrick's Day 1916 in England reviewing the Irish Guards in the presence of the King and Lord Kitchener. The King would tell the Irish Guards he was pleased to see them wearing Shamrock, the badge which unites all Irishmen, and you've shown that it stands for loyalty, courage and endurance. In post-independent Ireland, the pubs would remain shut on the day of the national apostle. And for Kevin O'Higgins, the Justice Minister who had introduced the Holy Hour, forcing the closure of pubs between 2:30 and 3:30, he felt there were just too many pubs and there was a need for licensing reform. He raised that point in the Dáil. He said Ireland boasts some 15,000 licensed publicans, one for every 250 people in the 26 counties, and an indication, he said, of the seriousness of the drink problem and of the need for some comprehensive and well-conceived measure of reform. He pointed favourably to the declining numbers of licences north of the border and insisted that some such measure is necessary here too, gradually reducing the number of public houses by about 50% and compensation paid to those publicans whose licences are withdrawn. So in other words, the new state was keen to greatly reduce the number of public houses in Irish life, and opening pubs on St. Patrick's Day was not on the agenda. The issue would emerge sporadically in the Dáil over subsequent decades. There's a great line in 1931 that if the public houses were open on that day, the Irish people would make beasts of themselves. And the price of drink, one deputy said, is now so high that nobody need to be afraid that if the public houses were open on St. Patrick's Day, there would be an orgy of drunkenness. Now imagine thinking that in 1931. The less licensing legislation we have, the better, one TD said. If the prohibitionists really want people to give up drinking altogether, the best way to secure it would be to have the public houses open day and night. But defending the closure of pubs on the day, a Fianna Fáil TD said that it was one of the ideals of the national struggle, that we should honour St. Patrick's Day with an abstention from drink. In other parts of the world, he regretted to say, Irishmen did get drunk on St. Patrick's Day. Remarkably, it was well into post-independence Ireland in the 1960s before public houses opened, formally at least, on the 17th of March, and thus died the tradition of seeking out a pint among sections of the population. A little bit like Good Friday, there are always ways and means. There are some particularly elaborate means of getting a drink on the day. For example, the Royal Dublin Dog Show held in the RDS, which had a dispensation to serve alcohol and always enjoyed particularly healthy crowds each Patrick's Day. But I think most preferred the quiet knock on the closed shutter of a local. And as time went on, enforcement of that ban just became more and more difficult. In 1961, it's not really a big news story when the Herald told their readers public houses opened their doors legally for the first time in more than 30 years today. By then, the parade as we know it was firmly established. The first in 1931 had been a pretty dour military affair, but by the 1960s, the parade had taken on pretty much a recognisable form to today. Community and commercial dimensions, Irish America parading on the streets of Dublin. RTE told their viewers in 1965 in Dublin the parade is dominated by industrial products. And this was Ireland itself as a product.
Getting a kick out of life as well as showing a fine piece of leg, drum majorettes from America. Drum majorettes as American as sauerkraut hamburgers on the 4th of July, but with tremendous international appeal.
Reflecting on the battle for St. Patrick's Day, a member of the Gaelic League looking back on it all would say decades later, it's hard for the people of the present day to realise that St. Patrick's Day was just an ordinary working day, up to the time of our National Holiday Committee. People went to Mass in the morning and then went to work. They just wore a bit of shamrock in their hats or a bit of green ribbon in their coats to mark the day that was in it. And until we had won a strong force of public opinion in favour of the holiday, we couldn't get the parliamentary party to make a move. It's terrible to think we had to seek the aid of John Bull to make St. Patrick's Day a national holiday, but I'm convinced if we had not done so, Patrick's Day would still be an ordinary working day. Well, it isn't, and thanks to the Gaelic League for that. Banachty, Lá Eilapóric Liv Galer.